All right, thank you for tuning in. This is Approach Towards Reduction of Addiction Through Treatment as a Crime versus a Public Health Concern by Theron Tracanna. Let's begin by talking about nature versus nurture. Nature versus nurture is an age-old debate in psychology. What the debate is this behavior in a person or animal caused by nature or encoded in their instincts or their DNA? Are they forced to act this way because of their nature as a being? Or is it caused by nurture, the environment around that living creature? Nurture can include things like how you were raised, the environment you happen to live in, economic status. A good example to understand the concept of nature versus nurture is to think of Pavlov's experiment, where he taught dogs to salivate when a bell was rang by feeding them whenever the bell was rung. Dogs don't initially, from birth, have the instinct to salivate whenever a bell is rung, but they do salivate when food is presented to them. So the nature is that the dog salivates when food is presented to them, and the nurture is teaching them to hear that bell and associate it with the food. Now we will discuss the relevance of this topic. To begin with, 80 billion taxpayer dollars go to prisons and jails every year. That's money coming out of yours and my pockets every year that could be spent on communities, grants for school, kind of relevant to us as college students, other things that generally would improve our lives are spent on keeping people in cages. In addition to that, 46% of the people that are kept in cages are there for drug-related charges. So to change the way that we approach drug-related issues in our society is to reduce the amount of money spent on keeping people in prison and saving us money so that we can use it for other beneficiary programs. An additional piece of relevance is that the United States ranks number one in deaths related to drug use disorders. Drug use disorders being the more scientific term for issues pertaining to addiction. Addiction is more of a colloquial term. I will continue to use that throughout this piece, but charts and data may show drug use disorders instead. As you can see, we are leading with 18.83 deaths per 100,000 people in our country. The next closest is Canada with only 6. We're beating them by nearly 3 times the amount in deaths related to drug use disorders. To construct a psychological backgrounded framework, we're going to discuss a study that's known colloquially as Rat Park. This study is actually titled The Effect of Housing and Gender on Morphine Self-Administration in Rats. In this study, a scientist named Bruce K. Alexander observed studies where rats were placed in cages with 2 bottles to drink out of. Rats were given a bottle of water from the tap, so tap water, and also a bottle containing sucrose, which is like a sugar sweetener, as well as morphine in increasingly spiked doses, so more and more percentage of morphine included in these bottles over time. Rats in the cages were found to drink from the morphine-laced bottles until they either overdosed and died, or they overdosed and couldn't drink anymore. Either way, consistently, rats were forced to drink until they were dead under these conditions. This was believed to be because nature drove mammalian brains, mammal brains, to whatever the reward centers of their brain demanded. And there was a chemical hook in the morphine that was somehow causing animals, mammals, to be forced to drink until they die. Now, after observing these studies, Bruce K. Alexander and his team actually tested to see, is it the case that they're forced to drink because of their propensity to have to drink morphine in order to sustain their addiction? Or were they drinking because they had nothing else to do and they were trapped in a cage and they were restricted from all their other normal rat activities? So, what Alexander and his team did is they built what's called Rat Park. That's why this study is called that, where it's a large box that had a painting of trees on the walls, and there was lots of fun things to do for the rats. They could all interact with each other. These rats were provided with the same two bottles, the morphine and the tap water, in the same amounts over the same periods of time, and they were found to not drink nearly as much of the morphine. In fact, they mostly drank the tap water. They never overdosed under these conditions where they had Rat Park to live in. And they found an extremely large difference in ratio of how much the rats were drinking. The difference was the rats in the cages drank 16 times the amount of the rats in Rat Park for males and 5 times the amount of rats in Rat Park for females. With this study, Alexander and his team were able to demonstrate that nurture mattered just as much as nature when it came to addiction and substance use in mammalian brains. There have been critiques of this study where they say that there are things about rats that are difficult to translate to humans, like socioeconomic factors, other conditions that humans have that rats don't have. And yet they still agree that this is a strong, well-structured story with real evidence behind it that can be used to discuss the importance of environment in the cases of addiction. They have to concede that much. This is a strong historic study performed in 1979. Now we will take a look at the U.S. prison population. U.S. prison population is extremely high compared to the rest of the world. Taking a look at these two pie charts I made, you can see that the U.S. population has a case of 4% of the world's population, yet we make up 20% of the global prison population. 1/5 of the people in prison in the world come from a country that only makes up 4% of the population. Now we will discuss the approach to controlling substances as a crime. To begin with, we will watch a clip from the channel Knowing Better in their 2020 video, The Quartering of Troops and Police Militarization. The timestamps we're going to watch are from 6 minutes and 1 second to 7 minutes and 19 seconds of that video.
If I were to ask you to list everything you would consider to be a crime, there would probably be some obvious ones like murder and theft. But most everything else wasn't a crime 100 years ago. In 1920, the United States federal government decided that the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol was now against the law. Something that was legal in 1919 was now a crime. This was when the vague cultural concept of crime was formed, because people still wanted to do that thing that was totally fine a year ago. They're not murderers or thieves, they're just Criminals. If you're at all familiar with history, this is the part where I tell you that capitalism did what capitalism does, and a black market arose to supply that demand. People still wanted to drink. This took the form of moonshiners in the woods and the mafia and organized crime in the cities. Making something illegal created criminals. Most things that we consider to be crimes are only crimes because we arbitrarily decided to make them illegal. They're consensual acts that generally have no victim. Prohibition is widely regarded as a massive failure. By labeling something consensual as a crime, they turned many previously innocent people who were minding their own business into criminals, and by extension, created organized crime.
That video does an excellent job breaking down how crimes as a concept were created by us and don't always serve the purposes that we intend them to. Now, looking at prohibition, crimes are conceptual, so they created criminals, they created crime, they applied a threat of punishment on top of the already ill-advised decision to drink alcohol, which may be poisoned, or in what we're discussing today, using drugs, which may be poisoned or otherwise cause bodily harm to you. So you're already making a bad decision. Adding more punishment on top of that, not exactly the most convincing thing, even at face value. In addition to that, Prohibition killed roughly 1,000 people per year until it ended, which, drawing back on what we just discussed, the case of drugs being illegal and treated as a crime is also leading to many deaths per year. In fact, we're leading. Now we will watch a clip from FD Signifier's video in 2023, The Police Won't Save Us. This clip is going to show us a good breakdown of the crime bill, which is the most recent bill that was put out back in the 90s to try to be tougher on crime, purporting to reduce crime statistics, to clean up the streets, to improve society. Much like Prohibition, the timestamps we're going to watch of this video are 21 minutes and 1 second through 23 minutes and 2 seconds.
But a change of sorts came in the early 90s when Bill Clinton became the first Democratic president in 12 years and one of only 2 Democrats to be the president in almost a 40-year period. And this happened because Clinton led a rightward shift in Democratic policies, promising to address crime and cult welfare. And with some help from third-party spoiler Ross Perot, Clinton beat incumbent George Bush Sr. to become president in 1992.
Congratulations.
2 years later, Clinton would make good on his promise to address crime, which culminated in the 1994 crime bill, guided by his wife and future senator/presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and current president and former vice president Joe Biden.
It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street.
The crime bill has been talked about a ton in the last decade or so as the disastrous results of it have now really become impossible not to notice. Policymakers at that time leaned into tough on crime ideology as opposed to the more obvious and also well-known research around social and community development to address crime. The bill made little to no investment into the poor by design urban centers of America that I spoke about earlier. Instead of investment in those cities, millions were spent on funding the police, expanding federal prisons, and fighting the war on drugs. Policies were instituted for mandatory minimum sentences, 3-strike rules, and countless other new reasons to put predominantly poor people and disproportionately black people in prison. One of the most notable elements being the violent offender incarceration and truth in sentencing incentive grant program, which gave out $12.5 billion in grant money, not for education, healthcare, housing, or community investment, but for building prisons to house all the newly incarcerated.
Now, making drugs illegal may not initially sound like a bad thing, but criminalizing addiction has caused harm. As I've discussed with you, drug use disorders death rate has only risen since the crime bill. Those addicted cannot safely access help or treatment without fear of being punished or penalized for the crime they committed as criminals. Let's take a look at a graph showing just how well this policy has worked out. Taking a look at the amount of drug disorder related deaths starting in 1990 all the way to 2019, you can see that the United States has done a bang up job of increasing drug related disorder deaths. That chart is drastic. Many of us understand that being in prison is not a favorable location. Putting human beings in cages calls back to another experiment in which rats were put in cages and the effects it had on them. Human beings put in prison are 5 times more likely to be infected with HIV. And as many know, the darker sides of prison culture likely happening without their consent. In addition to that, 10 to 20% of inmates suffer from a mental illness, which is often made worse during their incarceration. Once their prison sentence is over, the cage never really leaves. See, once you've been convicted with a felony, that tends to follow you for the rest of your life. It's harder to get a job, it's harder to make anything of yourself. Applying to rent a place, you have to let them know that you're a convicted felon. Everything about you, even though you've served your time, has been stained. Even though you've paid your debt to society, you're being held back from having a normal life again. There's a loss of community. Many children of people that are incarcerated end up with antisocial behavior. Antisocial in this case meaning behavior that may let them themselves end up in prison. In addition to that, 6,500,000 Americans return from prison each year. Roughly half of those people are going to return to prison within a few years because of that cage never really leaving a person after they've spent the time in that prison. Many people who leave prison say that the way that it affects them emotionally is that they sometimes even want to go back to prison because of how psychologically damaging spending time in prison really is. That loss of control, the way they feel and interact with people in society, has permanently been changed. Now we will take a look at the approach to addiction as a public health concern. These treatments involve changing people's environment around them rather than applying a concept of a possible future worse punishment. Community action is taken rather than making vague threats. Not putting people in cages, much like not putting the rats in cages, has had much greater success in reducing the costs and the death rates of illicit drug use and addiction. So, cases of harm reduction involve things like providing people that are addicted to opioid agonists as treatment. These are drugs which reduce withdrawal symptoms and keep people from wanting to go back on the drug. A physical thing provided to them to get them to stop doing the illicit drug. In addition to that, clean needles and syringes are provided. Those are keeping people from developing diseases or getting infections from injecting themselves with drugs, a real physical thing that reduces the harm caused by these drugs. In addition to that, they have supervised drug consumption rooms. These are more controversial, but what they function as is a clean, safe environment with which a person could use drugs under supervision, usually while trying to reduce their addiction to the drug. They use it over time in small doses to wean their way off of the drug, because withdrawal symptoms, if you quit cold turkey for stronger drugs, can kill you. The withdrawal itself can cause you to die. So these kinds of places allow people to safely use the drug as they're weaning off of it. In addition to that, another harm reduction, real physical ways to reduce the harm. Take home naloxone kits. These allow people to help others if they're overdosing on opioids. I actually own a naloxone kit that I received from my mother, who's a nurse. Essentially, what it is a nasal spray where when you find somebody who happens to be addicted to opioids and is overdosing, you can give them this one-time dose nasal spray, and it will rapidly stop the overdose and bring them back from the brink of death in very short periods of time. These are good to have on hand. Once you know that they exist, it's always good to have one that you know where it is. If you could keep one in your bag, if you find somebody that's overdosing, you could save their life. It's just like knowing how to perform CPR. So, wrapping up this presentation, I have some recommendations. My recommendations are to stop focusing on using concepts and cages to reduce drug use, to stop punishing people after serving their time so they can stay off the problematic behaviors that they have been engaging in, and to start focusing on creating desirable environments, creating nurture that makes people want to stop doing drugs and want to live cleaner lives rather than one that continues to keep them in that cage even after they've been released from a physical cage. As a review of my main points, we talked about nature versus nurture, the relevance to us, Rat Park, prison populations, addiction as a crime, criminalizing addiction and how it causes harm, environments in prisons, factors after prisons, addiction as a public health concern, harm reduction, and recommendations by me.